As Julian pointed out, as Julian pointed out, my book is forthcoming and I've just submitted to the press the final version. So I will actually kind of give you an overview of what I'm doing in the book, which I take to be a kind of a response to the ongoing crisis in psychiatry, which, is even hard to identify exactly like which kind of crisis we are talking about. I'll talk about one of them, or what I take to be a fundamental crisis in psychiatry. Um, of course, like my context is mostly the United States and a kind of a DSM dominated research and clinical model. But I think some of the points that I'm making are going to be generalizable for a lot of our colleagues in Europe and around the world. So one of the sources of, I think, crisis in psychiatry is this kind of conflict or like lack of alignment between psychiatry's research efforts and clinical efforts, where it shouldn't be. What do I mean by this? So when we look at the kind of, history of psychiatry in the last, like 70, 80 years or so, um, there has been a lot of interest in understanding the etiology of mental disorders, the causal mechanisms underlying mental disorders. And the kind of assumption has been if we just unpack and understand the etiology, we will be able to find treatments to kind of address that kind of causal etiology. So a lot of investment, and by investment, I mean both the financial investment and the kind of time and energy investment, went into like studying genetics, neuroscience, psychopharmacology. A lot of the kind of, what we might call like basic sciences kind of became predominant. I mean, if you just look at the National Institute of Mental Health's funding distribution, you will find a lot of studies, like animal studies, that purportedly will reveal us how like Alzheimer's in humans evolve, right? So there's been a lot of focus on this kind of research outcome. So most recently, the RDoC research domain criteria framework is an example of it. On the other hand, psychiatry's like clinical goals, right, kind of took the sideway in terms of the priority, the interest, and the funding that it received. So what do I mean by clinic? So ultimately, a lot of clinicians, psychiatrists, psychiatric residents are on a day-to-day basis dealing with individuals who are in distress, who are in experiencing some kind of mental disorder or distress if you choose not to medicalize it, and they have to find solutions to address and like help those individuals. Unfortunately, however, um, kind of they have been sidelined. One of the, I think, sources of tension is that this research kind of academic research paradigm has been like, yeah, let's understand the genetics, let's understand all of these small things, and ultimately we will find out. So like programs like RDoC are playing the long game. Like eventually we will understand the mechanisms underlying mental disorders. Whereas in the clinic, the clinicians have more urgent needs that need to be addressed right now. So this kind of issue, right? Like, do we invest in now to get the outcome in the long term, or do we prioritize now? I think that had distribution of efforts have not been managed well. In fact, a philosopher of psychiatry, Katie Tapp, calls this like diachronic injustice. While we're, kind of investing in the future of psychiatry, we are like overlooking the, present needs of patients and so on and so forth. So now the question is how to better align research and clinical goals. Like, and kind of how did we end up in these like two different kinds of frameworks where somehow the research that's being put into understanding mental disorders is not necessarily being helpful in the clinical context. So I'm a philosopher of science and mind, and you will see kind of my training or background in the talk that I'm giving. I've been talking to a lot of philosophers of science who now have been kind of turning into this, what they call philosophy of science and practice view, which basically calls for the inclusion of scientists, policymakers, and philosophers to kind of to think about the nature and applications of science together. So like, as philosophers of science, you can kind of sit in your armchair and think about like how science should be, what is science, what is the demarcation criteria or whatever. But what you say might not really be meaningful in the kind of context of practice. So what they're promoting is kind of more interaction. This will benefit philosophers, but it will also benefit policymakers or scientists, practicing scientists themselves, where they will be able to kind of become more reflective about their practices and think about what is it that they are doing and how what they are doing is affecting the kind of community at large and the public and so on. And I think psychiatry can really benefit from this kind of um, approach to thinking about the nature of its crisis or the nature of like psychiatric inquiry. So kind of overall, I want to invite both psychiatrists and like philosophers to think more about the practice of psychiatry when we're thinking about what kind of science it is. So in practice, I mean, ultimately, I take psychiatry to be an intervention-oriented science, meaning the ultimate goal is to help individuals who are in distress, right? By either diagnosing them and kind of providing them with the kind of necessary treatments, or maybe helping them kind of, find their own niche in some other way. So in that sense, like maybe, if different from other kinds of sciences or, something different from some other sciences, biological sciences, perhaps, the goal is not just to explain and predict, but also intervene and make a change, right? And in that sense, I take it to be essential for psychiatry to think more about the self or the individual who is the subject of mental disorder, to really understand what is happening when the person reports that they are in some kind of distress. So, and ultimately, when we think about psychiatry as an intervention-oriented science, we might want to kind of rethink this, almost division between the clinical branch and the like research branch and say, listen, we're trying to understand what is it, what is it that people are experiencing when they are reporting mental distress or, seem to be suffering from some kind of mental disorder. And we need all the knowledge we can have about that particular mental disorder or the individual in distress. So what we turn to when we're thinking about like this kind of broad abstract question about like, what is mental disorder, we might kind of look at scientific practices like the ones I just cited, right? Genetics, psychopharmacology, or different kinds of classification systems and so on and so forth, see what they reveal. Another source of knowledge is actually coming from clinicians and clinical practices directly, right? When I talk to my psychiatrist colleagues, they're almost as frustrated with the research branch of psychiatry as, as philosophers are, because they feel like they're increasingly not giving them results and tools to use in the clinic when they're actually dealing with patients. But yet, when we look at these kind of clinicians, right, not just psychiatrists in a way, like social workers, psychologists, people who are in the kind of business of treating people, they kind of have a lot of wisdom and knowledge based on their experiences and interactions and overall exhibitions with people. And now I think we're in this like wonderful moment in the history of psychiatry where kind of we have more opportunities to think better about the individual who is subject to mental distress or who's diagnosed with mental disorder. How do we have that? Well, first, increasingly, there are a number of people who, might identify as survivors or patients or ex-patients. Increasingly more people are talking about their experiences, writing about their experiences. So they have, self-reports that kind of tell us a little bit about what it is like that they're experiencing when they're in mental distress, in distress. But also we have a lot of research coming in, like from psychology, sociology, anthropology, from cognitive sciences and social sciences about the self or the individual that we might really kind of think about when we are thinking about like, what is it that the nature of mental disorder or how people are experiencing this stress. So unfortunately, historically, scientific practices and maybe clinical practices have been kind of part of the picture of psychiatry in, its acquisition of what it is meant, what mental disorders are, but there has been rarely any room for either self-reports coming from individuals themselves or research in cognitive sciences about the self. So that's my main issue. So I will briefly kind of talk about how the self has gone missing in scientific psychiatry by what I call twin failures. And then I will kind of propose a way in which we can reclaim the self in psychiatry through a model of the self that I developed in the book. So This is the only thing that I know about the book. This is the kind of the image that's going to come in the that's going to be the cover image, and that there's I don't have anything, and I don't know anything else about it, and but I know that it will be out in April. So when I think about like the self and and mental disorder relationship, so I'm like I have a very kind of basic kind of exposition. Okay, so mental disorders are things that are expressed in the form of anomalies in self-related capacities or attitudes. So somebody might, feel like they no longer have self-control, or they are not able to meet their own needs. They have like problems in self-efficacy and so on and so forth. And these kinds of self-related issues express themselves in the form of their relationship with other people. So they deteriorate their relationship with self and others. And in general, right, in traditions in mental health care, in the clinic, acknowledge this. And they do kind of work on the individual and like, kind of try to practice, like talk to the individual about their life and their self and so on and so forth. Yet when we look at scientific psychiatry, the concept of the self has rarely been a target of inquiry. And this has negative implications for scientific research because we're simply overlooking a phenomena that could really explain or help us kind of navigate mental disorders better. But also it has like various implications for developing clinical interventions, or even kind of the way in which individuals understand their mental distress or disorder. So, and my goal is like to fill this gap and kind of to try to sketch the contours of what psychiatry might look like and what psychiatric crisis might look like when we start thinking about the self. So I'm fully aware of the controversy around the very concept of the self, right? Like that's the one of the most metaphysically messy terms that we can like, I don't know, have like 5 conferences on the subject. So when I think about the self that, could be a good target of analysis in psychiatry, I don't have in mind like the transcendental views that equate the self to the soul, right? Nor do I kind of get into more like deflationary approaches as to whether self is real or not, like is it determinate or not, like these more metaphysical questions. I rather kind of take as my basis that the concept of the self features very well in our folk psychologies. Everybody talks about themselves, and there's a lot of research in cognitive and social sciences that either directly investigate or talk about the self or self-related capacities, right? Like self-knowledge or self-control, and especially like topics like self-control are big research topics right now. So when you look at scientific psychiatry, in an effort to move away from a psychoanalytic picture of the mind and kind of coming up with psychiatric classifications or scientific understandings of mental disorders, there's this kind of like overall kind of having done away with the concept of the self. There's like this heavy association of the concept with Freud, and Freud is not scientific, therefore we should not be using anything like scientific or anything self-related. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But rather, I think, we can, update this conception of the self with more recent and more scientific approaches to the self in cognitive sciences and social sciences, and think more intelligently about what it is to be a self. And, what is it about our cognitive structure, infrastructure, that sometimes we end up ourselves in these moments of like distress, and that might lead to disorder? What is it about human cognition that might sometimes not work as well as we, think it does, or it might cause stress or whatever, right? So I think that's an important target that has not been kind of investigated carefully. And the other kind of, when I think about the self, I think about turning to people, right? Like this might be like maybe self as a research target kind of coming from a more scientific perspective, but we can also think about the self from a more testimonial perspective, where we can think of individuals who are reporting about their subjective experiences, right? They have not really kind of been, their testimonies have not been taken seriously by scientific psychiatry. I think we are in a much better space in terms of this, like in terms of the public and the larger philosophical world and phenomenological research, especially. Now we have more room, we are giving more uptake to self-reports. But when you turn to science, there's still like a lot of kind of hesitation about whether we can do science or whether we can be objective by if we take people's self-reports seriously. And the most kind of live example of this has come come in the kind of most recent bout of DSM-5 revisions, where there has been a call for the APA to include patients in the DSM kind of board to make decisions about the DSM-5 categories. But the DSM, like, APA task force really did not want that, citing what they think as like scientific reasons, that they kind of basically said that it will spoil all of our objective goals. We can't really make room for self-reports. So before I kind of deal with that challenge, I want to kind of zoom into exactly what self-reports tell us that we may not necessarily get from like a purely clinical or kind of scientific, microscientific approach, right? Especially, I think, one of the things that we can agree, at the end of these last 2 days is like we know very little about mental disorders still, right? So if that's the case, we should be open to anything and everything that we can learn about people's experiences who identify themselves to having some mental disorders or mental distresses. And of course, this is a very rich body of work, but we can classify perhaps what we can learn from self-reports or testimonies by thinking about, okay, we actually have an idea about what individuals what I call orientational challenges. Like when you're experiencing something like depression, right? You literally has that like physical dread of getting up in the morning, perhaps, right? That I think of as, something that directly affects your orientation in the world. And we can learn a lot about people's orientational challenges from their self-reports. We learn a lot about what I call hypernarratives, all the intricate interpersonal, social, cultural things that go into an individual's experience, right? When people talk about their mental disorders, right, they're not just talking about their mental disorder. You hear a story about the family. You hear a story about relationships. You hear a story about like, poverty and so on and so forth. So these give us kind of the thick world of the lived experience. We also learn like what I call therapeutic impact of psychiatric diagnosis, how basically what kind of treatment methods open up when people are diagnosed, right? For instance, in Ellen Sacks's memoir, she was diagnosed at a time that psychoanalysis was a dominant way of treatment of mental disorders, and then she was later kind of treated by using a more DSM, like updated DSM criteria. And she makes a comparison of the two different treatments. And that's something that you get directly from people's self-reports that you may not get from anywhere else. We also learn a lot about the reflective impact of diagnosis, which, this is a concept that maybe was promoted by Ian Hacking when he was writing about the looping effects of psychiatric diagnosis, how they change the way in which we think about ourselves and how that changed the phenomena at large. And I think this is a very important issue because we are not just kind of mentally, reflectively indifferent people. We think about our reasons for actions. We are reason-responsive agents. So the way in which we label ourselves might actually affect the way we respond to phenomena. So that's an important thing that we learn in self-reports. We also learn a lot about how people actually responded to their diagnosis or their mental disorders. So usually when people write their self-reports, there's, it's at least some stories, there's this kind of moment of like, yeah, and then I found this and this helped, and like, how basically people live their lives and even flourished, even withstanding mental disorders. And I think this is a very important point too, because usually, especially in the medical model, mental disorder is immediately equated to a horrible life of like misery. That is simply not the case. And if you read what people write about their experiences, you can actually see that these are not incompatible. You can flourish withstanding your mental health challenges. So, but look, one kind of like thing maybe that might be perhaps potentially problematic in thinking about like self-reports as a source of knowledge is something that actually Roy Dings, one of the organizers of this conference, and I wrote a paper about, is basically this idea of like hyponarratives. Sometimes people buy into or use the medical language to talk about their experiences. So we don't learn a lot about the individual. We learn about like how they understand their condition in medical terms. So one might say, well, self-reports can be limited in that it doesn't provide us like really anything about the individual, but we relearn or rehear whatever the medical language is. That's true, but I don't think that's a reason to undermine the value of self-reports in general, because maybe even seeing that might give us some information about the experience of mental disorders. So if this is the case, like if like kind of basic logic of like, yeah, we don't understand this phenomenon, let's turn into what people are experiencing and use that as a source of knowledge or think about more of the self. There has been a resistance to, what I will call self-related phenomena, for kind of rising from worries about like the concept of the self not being a scientific concept, right? One of them is what I call Freud problem, not because I think Freud is a problem, but I think a dominant kind of contemporary frameworks in scientific psychiatry regard Freud as a problem. And there's like this kind of false inference going on, something like, the self was a kind of subject of study for psychoanalysis, and we now established that psychoanalysis is not scientific, so therefore studying the self is not scientific. And this is an obvious, like kind of logically, false inference that it's simply not true. There are different conceptions and different ways of thinking about the self that are more scientifically alignable. So this should not be a reason to kind of override or neglect or not think about the self in the context of psychiatric science. Other concerns is what I just kind of include what I just briefly addressed, and I want to kind of zoom into that a little bit. When the DSM-5 was being revised, the American Psychiatric Association Task Force was invited to include representatives of patients in the DSM-5 task force so that people provide input as to whether these psychiatric categories are good or helpful and get their feedback overall. And there was a lot of advocacy and kind of activism around it. A lot of clinicians, Dan Stein and Catherine Phillips have an article about, how patient advocacy is very important when it comes to DSM. And now that we have to bring people in because they provide something specific and unique perspective that we cannot really get from a purely scientific or purely like clinical third person perspective. We also have people like John Sadler and Bill Fulford. They actually wanted even the families to be involved in the DSM's decision-making process. So, also there were lots of activism. This was the 2010 meeting of the American Psychiatric Association in San Francisco. And this was a time Occupy movement was very prevalent, and there were lots of activists protesting this very issue at the meeting. So interestingly, and I take this to be a positive step, the actual APA task force responded to these calls. Like they recognize that people want patients to be involved in the process, but they kind of have this it's a very short piece. It's like 2-3 pages. They do some lip service as to, yeah, it's very important, how patients see this for therapeutic alliance and so on and so forth. But they raise what they call what I would call epistemic issues. So they say, this is like a direct quote. By definition, subjectivity is variable from person to person, therefore making it impossible to develop an objective criteria that would apply to every disorder. Further, it raises the question of whose subjective experience will serve as a template by which criteria would be developed. So there is definitely these are very important points, but also I want to kind of draw attention to the way in which concepts like subjectivity or objectivity are used in this text. As philosophers, we can realize objectivity might mean a lot of different kinds of things, right? Or subjectivity might mean a lot of different kinds of things. So I think kind of just like brushing it off by saying that if we include individual and recognize their self-reports, we won't be objective. That's simply a very simplistic approach to, I think, thinking about objectivity, which I'll talk about in a minute. So another reason that we might be resistance, or there is resistance for including or thinking about self-related phenomena when it comes to scientific psychiatry is what I call the TikTok or reification problem. I don't know how many of you are on TikTok. I wasn't until my students pointed out these things, and now I'm on TikTok looking at it. So there are lots of teenagers on TikTok who self-diagnose. Not only like they self-diagnose, but they're basically kind of mentoring and teaching and talking about their purported mental disorder or purported, the label, educating other teens. So it ranges from people, like this young woman says, okay, if you answer more on these five of these things, you might have PTSD. I mean, in a very kind of DSM style, right? DSM has like the list of symptoms and signs, and now we see that in the form of like not aside from the outside of the clinical context, just in like teens narratives, right? Or signs that you might have ADHD. And a lot of teens come up with these kinds of like videos and so on and so forth. So one might think, well, do they really have these disorders? Or are they seeking some kind of attention? Or like, I mean, simply, like minimally, it shows to me that they haven't been able to receive the kind of support in their community that they're kind of trying to find ways to make sense of whatever is it that they're experiencing, right? So I don't think that they're faking it. I think that's just, like the wrong way to think about it. But I think there's something going on, and they're like labeling themselves and trying to educate other people about these labels, but it's unclear whether or not this way of interacting with their experiences will actually eventually help them. So one might say, again, like this is similar to the point that Roy and I raised, that, well, again, we are learning about the like medical language more than the kind of self-reports, right? So these are the kind of potential challenges. So in the book, basically, after laying out these possible challenges, I developed a kind of a proposal, a way of thinking about psychiatry in relation to the self that will also align with psychiatry's scientific goals to be a legitimate, objective, well-respected, like real science, right? So one of my first diagnosis is that the problem is not with the self not being a scientific target, but rather arises from psychiatry's assumptions about what science is. So when we think about like the kind of science in relation to the model of the self that I will be developing in a second, I take psychiatry to be just like other model building sciences in which models are designed for different goals. So when a patient actually comes to the clinic, right, I don't know if clinicians just immediately label them, right? In fact, they avoid it. Like a lot of psychiatrists and clinicians are kind of wary of like using labels as much as we are, right? As kind of more critical, inquirers. Like because ultimately they want to help the individual. But what they do is like just kind of like create a model of the person and like trying to help the person at hand. And I think psychiatry would benefit a lot more by thinking of itself as a model building science, right? Where different kinds of models of mental disorders are built to make, to understand mental disorders or to provide treatments and so on and so forth. And in that model, like if somebody wants to do genetics research, they can frame or they can model, they can use a model to think about like mental disorder in terms of genetics. But that doesn't work for every case, right? And the model of the self that I developed that I call Muse in short is a model of the person, right? The person in the clinic, and aims to offer tools for intervention. And so in that sense, properties of mental disorders that are relevant for intervention are bona fide scientific properties. And objectivity in this picture is not something that has to do with the outcome of scientific inquiry, right? I think when the creators of the DSM express worries about, how the inclusion of patients will spoil psychiatric objectivity, they think about psychiatric knowledge to be this like one conclusive thing, an objective matter of fact. But I think it's wrong to think about psychiatry and objectivity in that way, because rather psychiatry is a work in progress. And the introduction to DSM says it very clearly. None of these categories are final, but these are placeholders until we do something better. So if you're thinking about psychiatric research, psychiatric science as a process science, then we should think about objectivity more of a kind of feature of the process of doing science rather than the outcome of scientific inquiry. So, and of course, these kind of views are very much shaped by feminist approaches to philosophy of science and the concept of objectivity and so on and so forth. So, and now kind of like the big reveal. So what I think, what exactly is the multitudinous self model? So the basics, I'm actually agnostic about the metaphysics of the self. Like I do not want to answer the question of whether the self is real or not, because I'm not really interested in that. What I am interested is that the self is a useful concept for individuals who are experiencing mental disorders, and it is of interest for clinicians who are trying to treat people with diagnosis of mental disorders. And it should be of interest to scientists who are trying to understand the nature of mental disorder. So in that sense, like just as an assumption, we can say, well, self seems to be this like complex system of multiple mechanisms. But we can model it for different purposes to be used in science, right? And in that sense, like I take multitudinous self to be like a scientific model, and this is built very much under the influence of psychologists and cognitive scientists like William James, Ulrich Neisser, like more recently Bill Bechtel and Voltagard, and so on and so forth. So in this picture, but when you kind of look at this, I don't want you to think about these different facets as parts of the self. Again, like I'm not thinking about the metaphysics of the self, but rather, multitudinous self model is a way in which we can individuate, we can kind of approach the patient, right? It's the model of the patient. And we can kind of approach the patient by looking at their physical properties, physical features, right? From like, and by physical, I mean like really broadly, it can involve their other other illnesses, or their physical makeup, their brain, their genes, and so on and so forth, right? But what's also important that we see in this picture of the self is the social. Like if we situate the individual in a kind of social network, right? We want to learn about their family. We want to learn about their social relationships, their partnerships, friendships, and so on and so forth, right? That gives us information about that. The other very crucial, important part of or facet of the multitudinous self model is the experiential level. This is what people are experiencing and how they are talking about their experiences, right? This is crucial. This is fundamental. Even the experience, the very experience or reporting of a mental distress, has to pay attention to this experiential layer. The other important facet is the narrative facet, how people are talking about themselves, like what kind of stories that they tell about themselves, right? And these stories are not just kind of, our self stories that are immediately intrinsically shaped by the kind of culture and the social environment that we are in. And the other important kind of facet of the self is the conceptual, how individuals conceptualize themselves, how they think about themselves, how they represent themselves to themselves, and how like this kind of self-representation is not just descriptive. It doesn't just give us an idea about the individual or how they're thinking about themselves, but also these our ideas about ourselves also shape how we behave and how we think about and how we plan things. So it's very, very important to understand that. And this model, basically, I kind of tried to construct a model that is empirically plausible, that, when people are looking at this picture, they can kind of relate or, understand or think about themselves in these kind of concepts. That is responsive to research in cognitive and social sciences, and as well as naturalistic philosophy. I think there's really, really important empirically informed philosophy of mind that investigates the phenomenon of the self in this kind of more empirically grounded ways that we can really benefit from when we are thinking about like psychiatry as a science. And the other important aspect kind of or feature of the multitudinous self model is to try to get us to think about mental disorders in a more kind of integrated way, right? Like whatever happens in your social world or social facet ends up affecting your conceptual. So there are these tight relationships between these different facets, right? Whatever happens in one system or some mechanism affects the other parts. And that's integral, because what we learned, right, so far all of the micro kind of level investigation and scientific research, whether it's genetics or neuroscience, did not really give us fruitful results for the clinic, because ultimately we're trying to separate kind of the parts. But rather, I'm pushing for a kind of more integrated, holistic approach to understanding the self, who is the subject of mental disorder. And I'm thinking of this model to serve as an interface between like scientific, clinical, and personal aspects of experiences of mental disorders. So, and it also provides conceptual and practical tools for clinicians and individuals that, to help people who are in distress. In that sense, for instance, a clinician, right, in this picture is now coming to the patient that's coming in their clinic in the kind of from the lens of muse, right? Oh, like this person is actually a complex individual who has like these physical, social, conceptual, experiential, narrative aspects. I should kind of try to get a picture of that, all of those different aspects to get a full picture of the patient. And in doing so, right, the clinician can bring their encounter with the patient in the sense and kind of their understanding of the patient itself, and align that with their past clinical experience, right, clinical expertise and scientific expertise to kind of arrive at a good picture of the individual so that they can tailor and customize what is it that the patient that they think that they might need. And also my other kind of motivation to kind of try and think about mental disorders and mental distresses from the lens of the self is that I don't think medicalization is always helpful to individuals, right? Not everyone benefits from their experience being labeled as a mental disorder. But if you think about kind of, these mental distresses or experiences in the continuum of the self, then I think that might open up more resources for people in the way that they conceptualize themselves. And that would not be of interest to psychiatry, but kind of like one of the kind of larger pictures is that. So at my previous institution at the University of Texas at San Antonio, I worked with a wonderful group of psychologists. And they were really intrigued by this model of the self. So we did a little bit of science. I mean, they did science, but I provided the conceptual framework. These psychologists are actually funded by the Veterans Affairs. And interestingly, in the United States, Veterans Affairs funds a lot of kind of biopsychosocial style research, unlike the National Institute of Mental Health, because they're very interested in veterans who are back from the war to go back again, right? They want to keep people deployed. So there's a lot of effort in kind of addressing PTSD and other kind of mental health problems when people are coming from the front lines. So that means they have a lot of research and funding and resources to do a kind of an overall inventory of individuals' experiences coming back from the front lines. So we were interested in kind of thinking about substance use disorders, right, which, is a form of mental disorder, right? And we wanted to see if the kind of multitudinous self model, if this framework will reveal us like any kind of correlations or relationships between different like facets of people's experiences. And we did have this kind of questionnaire that they had collected prior to this study. It's called the Trajectories of Resilience and Comorbidity Clusters in Operations Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom Veterans. It's a very long name. But basically, the idea is they collected data from a large group of veterans on kind of, how they socialize when they returned from the war. Do they have any other physical illnesses? And how is their substance use behavior? And so on and so forth. So what we did basically is to use this kind of nationwide survey that comes from interviews with post 9/11 veterans, and we try to look at explanatory resourcefulness of the Muse model in kind of predicting whether these individuals will have substance use disorders. And this is kind of how it looked like. Again, as I said, this survey was quite detailed. It was one of the best of the kind that I've seen. It really went into ask questions to veterans and about a lot of different kind of paths and aspects of their lives that nicely aligns with the 5 dimensions or 5 facets of the multitudinous self model. So to kind of to look at the physical features, we looked at we took the questions about their existing health conditions, and we measured those existing health conditions with diagnostic codes. To individuate the social facet, there were lots of questions about the quality of their relationships, which meaning how they integrated back when they got home. Did they have a good social support system? Did they have relationships and kids, and how their relationship with those kind of social in their social world went? We also there was also a kind of part that gave us information about their sense of their experiences. So there were lots of questions that track patients' symptoms over time. So like when you first came, you were feeling this. Do you still feel that? So there was this kind of like temporal evaluation of like patients or the individuals like over time. There were also questions that kind of got to their self-perception. So one task that we used to look at this was to self-efficacy for life tasks. So basically this means their perceived confidence in their ability to complete their life tasks, like whether they can hold a job or take care of a family and so on and so forth. So that gave us some information about what I would call the conceptual facet of the self. And finally, we kind of looked at, what I would call the narratives, like how they perceive, their health trajectory over time, what kind of, things that they explain, or what kind of stories that they tell about like how their health changed over time and so on and so forth. So after this, our results basically were really interesting. So again, like this is like a very baby study, and I do not claim to be a scientist or think that, oh, like this shows us everything that we need to learn. But I think this kind of, shows some promises. So what the like the fundamental thing that came out of the study was that that Muse model was not trivial. Like it really kind of does tell some kind of historic about the causal pathways among each phase of the Muse model. The most significant finding was better community reintegration after military service, correlated with reduced substance use disorder diagnosis. So, basically, the idea that like if you have better social connections, that's critical for positive outcomes. And one of the kind of other things that we kind of thought about in this like model that when we found that there are relationships between all of these different facets was, well, maybe it's kind of good to use a multi-model assessment of the individual so that we don't have any gaps in context, right? So that we understand like how the social might relate to the experiential and the conceptual and narrative. Again, if our goal is to directly help the individual. So in fact, maybe a lack of attention to these critical features is part of the story of like high relapse for substance use disorders. So I think basically the social facet was the kind of most telling facet in terms of its relationship or its prediction with substance use disorder, but the others were also show some non-trivial connections. All this is to say that I think by thinking about mental disorders in relation to the self, we can open up a kind of a door for different kinds of scientific inquiry into mental disorders that still will align with like psychiatry's scientific goals. I don't think that like multitudinous self model has to be that model. This is a model of the self that I think could be useful in kind of making sense of mental disorders, helping individuals, in thinking about psychiatry as a kind of intervention oriented science. But there are also there can be other different kinds of like self models that can be used in kind of scientific context as much as in clinical context. So, and this model basically, I think, kind of might ease some of the worries associated with kind of resistance to using self-related phenomena in thinking about psychiatry as a form of science. So one is what I call the Freud problem, right? Like self is a psychoanalytic concept. We shouldn't talk about it. I mean, and I think there's lots of like, wrongs or mistakes in that statement itself. But you might kind of minimally say, look, the concept of the self is not or does not just have to be a psychoanalytic concept. There are different ways of thinking about the self, especially in relation to self-reports and research coming from cognitive and social sciences and even in philosophy. right? We can kind of make use of these kind of more updated concepts of self in thinking about the self of the patient and trying to model the patient. And ultimately, insofar as like self is a useful concept, even for the patient themselves, we might, it's highly likely that we will get good kind of outcomes. And this, basically, self is not an unscientific subject or a target. And the other issue is like subjectivity, objectivity problem, right? And as I said, if we construe objectivity as a feature of scientific inquiry, we can think of like science as like social knowledge and think about objectivity as something that happens. It's more about the process of doing science rather than the outcome of doing science. And we can kind of try to strive for what I call participatory interactive objectivity, which means basically there's an ongoing interaction between scientists, which we can call technical experts, clinicians, which we can also call technical experts, and individuals with diagnosis of mental disorders. So these are first-person reports, testimonial experience, and we can call them as experts by experience. So in this kind of interaction and dialogue, nobody's statement kind of wins over the other one, right? So this means basically that in practice we need more conferences that host both philosophers and psychiatrists and individuals who identify themselves as having some kind of mental disorder. There needs to be more conversations between these different groups, and this process, this kind of this dialogue and interaction, will hopefully, what feminist philosophers have called like transformative criticism, where we will all kind of learn things and kind of try to arrive at a mutual understanding where we'll all kind of see the kind of what's going on. And I think this is extremely important for psychiatry because, again, we do not know, we don't have a full picture of what mental disorders are yet. So the more interaction we have between different constituents, between different kinds of experts, the kind of better, I think, pathways we will draw, especially when it comes to developing effective interventions. And the multitudinous self model also addresses, the TikTok problem, because again, the model is not just grounded on people's self-reports, what they say about their experiences, but also grounded on other kind of social sciences and cognitive sciences that does research on the subject and the society and the self and so on and so forth. So again, in this kind of trilateral strategy where different kinds of experts interact with one another, we can, a clinician might, after having a conversation with the teenager, for instance, might be like, okay, so here's what I'm thinking. Maybe, these are the kind of, maybe you're having some attention problems. And here's like, we can think of it as ADHD, but we can also think of it this way. And in the, in the meantime, they can also think about, okay, what does this particular teenager might need, what might have led them to go online and push this, and try to kind of really engage with that and address that. So this basically requires not just listening to self-reports, but also kind of listening to thinking more broadly about, how people want to be recognized and how they kind of, looking at research that looks at self-concepts and children's developments of their narratives and so on and so forth, which we have a lot in developmental psychology. Overall, what Muse is trying to do is to bring clinical or to bring scientific psychiatry to listen to social sciences, cognitive science, philosophy, and self-reports as much as it listens to psychopharmacology, genetics, and more basic sciences. And when we think about psychiatry as an applied science, as an intervention-oriented science, engaging with these different areas of inquiry actually is only natural. So in that sense, this model, Muse, does not jeopardize psychiatry's scientific commitments. Rather, it enhances it. It redefines what it means for a clinical discipline to be scientific by promoting more engagement with social and cognitive sciences, as well as expanding notions of objectivity and expertise, right? In this picture, patients, at least some patients, are experts, right? So we are kind of broadening our definition of expertise to include also the individuals with experiences, not just people who are trained in the subject matter. And if we understand psychiatry in terms of its goals, which is to help people ultimately flourish, we can kind of realize that actually the self should be a fundamental research target because it's not ideal, neither scientifically or clinically. And thanks for listening.
Hey, thank you. So we're going to do our normal thing of taking a 5-minute break for people to put up questions and look at the questions that have already been put there. I think we'll probably just begin from the top as we did earlier. So there's a few questions that have already been put in the chat. Feel free, everybody, to add some more. And we'll start again in about 5 minutes, 8:10. What time do we finish, right?
8:30.
8:30 finish, so that'll give us 20 minutes for a Q&A.